Welcome back to Higher Change. We are on Chapter 14, Perceiving is Believing. We're going to talk about sensation, perception, and the environment. In this chapter, perception is about how our mind organizes and interprets the information from our senses. In this chapter, you will describe how we get information from our world into our brains, describe the absolute threshold, what that means. You'll explain why some sensory information is ignored. You'll be able to describe constancy and Gestalt principles of perception. We'll explain how we perceive depth, and you'll identify some common visual illusions and the factors that influence our perception of them. Let's start with an awareness of our environment and how do we become aware of it. First of all, we have the ability to sense our environment, and sensation is the activation of receptors located in the eyes, ears, skin, nasal cavities, and tongue, and it allows us to receive information from the world around us. Sensory receptors are specialized forms of neurons that are stimulated by different types of energy, such as light, vibration, pressure, temperature, and chemical substances. So this diagram has tactile sensors in the skin. External stimuli activate the sensory receptors, which convert the stimulus into electrochemical messages that our nervous system can understand. This process is called sensory transduction. Transduction is how that message or signal is sent to the central nervous system. So if you can look at the diagram on the right, the top of it is the sensory receptors, and it transmits that information downward and through to the central nervous system. The absolute thresholds are the smallest amount of energy needed for conscious detection of a stimulus at least half the time it's present. So that basically means that a small little light can be detected from a long distance away because the brain and the eyes particularly, are able to pick up that light from a long distance, especially in the dark. And a little sound of a pin drop can be heard a long way away. And so the absolute threshold measures how little that stimulus can be before it's picked up. How do we see light? Well, the wavelengths that people can see are only a small part of the whole electromagnetic spectrum. If you look at the diagram on the right, you can see the visible light is like a fraction of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It's what we can see, and there's other parts that we can't. Let's talk about touch. So we talked about vision, and now let's talk about touch. What is often thought of as a sense of touch is really several sensations originated in several different places in and on the body. First, there's the skin sense, which involves touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. Then there's the kinesthetic senses. This is a location of one of body parts in relationship to another. So you can feel yourself moving. You can feel your legs moving or your arms moving. And then there's the vestibular senses, and this involves your sense of balance. This enables you to position your body and move it accurately. So all this information comes through the senses into your brain, but your mind has to be able to select what sensory information to pay attention to, or it will be quickly overwhelmed and flooded with all that information. So the mind has to filter out and decide what to pay attention to. So there's two methods our body uses to ignore unchanging information. First, there's habituation. For example, if you have a baby that's crying all the time, like I have my son, who cries a lot, over time, your brain starts to turn the volume down and you pay attention to certain things. So that's habituation. That is a cognitive or brain process that allows our mind to filter out some information and focus on others. So that's not to say you're going to ignore your child. You're just going to pick up on times when there is something changing or when there's something significant. So that may be a bad example, but another example that would be if you hear cars going by all the time, and you might come to ignore that those cars driving by, because your brain selectively tunes it out. The same thing if you hear crickets all the time or something like that. Over time, your brain becomes used to it, and it silences it, tunes it out, so that you can pay attention to other noises. Now, that's different from sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is a biological process in which your body tunes it out without necessarily using your thinking processes. So, for example, if you get into a cold swimming pool, at first you might feel, ooh, it's really cold, and you might not want to jump in right away. But if you step your toes in and you slowly wade in, then your body slowly adjusts to that new temperature. That's sensory adaptation. Another example of this would be if you're going into a room that has a different amount of light. So your eyes are going to adapt, whether it's more light or less light, your eyes are going to adapt to that new amount of light. So here's a picture of a landscape. What do you focus on? What is your eyes drawn to? What do your eyes filter out? What do you pay attention to in this picture? Some people might focus on the water. Some people might focus on the mill. Some people might look at the power line in the background. All of us are going to pay attention to different things in the scenery. How we do that is what our mind pays attention to, and that can say something about the kinds of things we like to focus on. Gestalt therapy, then, is about developing a sense of awareness about ourselves and our world, and including paying attention to what we are aware of. We're going to talk about Gestalt psychology, but if you look at it and that's different from Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy is simply the process of helping people to understand what they pay attention to and how they make meaning in the world. So let's talk about perception. That's different from the sensory, how our brain senses the world. What is perception and subconscious processing? So you might have heard of subliminal stimuli. A subliminal stimuli is when stimuli are just below the level of conscious awareness. This may be used in hypnosis or in advertising. Does it work, though? There's debate about it. Some people think that it doesn't really work. However, some others would say that advertising works because it creates exposure, and your mind creates memories about things. So whether or not it influenced you, that's different, because some people think it needs to operate at a conscious level. Nevertheless, we're constantly being bombarded by symbols and advertisements around us, and that can shape our perception of things. Illusions occur when individual perception does not match a physical stimulus. For example, if you take a look at this box, what do you see? Do you see a cube? If you look around the cube, you might discover that the shape changes. This is a visual illusion. We also see this used by magicians. Here's an example of a magician performing a trick. Magicians take advantage of some well-known properties of our visual system to accomplish a variety of tricks and illusions, or what is known as perceptual magic. By collaborating with these people, psychologists and neuroscientists can learn more about various cognitive and perceptual processes. So let's talk about perception. What is perception? Perception is the interpretation of sensation and seems to follow basic principles of constancy. So we've talked about sensation, but perception is the interpretation of sensation, or how our mind puts the information together and makes meaning out of it. So, for example, with magicians, our mind is going to interpret the senses and make meaning that, wow, something's amazing is happening, or it's not. We might be able to figure it out. So there's principles of perception, and so some of those include And let's talk about principles of constancy. Constancy is are principles that contribute to how we perceive things. So the first principle of constancy is size constancy. This is a tendency to perceive objects as always being the same size, no matter how close or far away they are. For example, if you look at the columns in this picture, you might think that all the columns are the same size. And now, this is a little harder to demonstrate in a two-dimensional video, but if you are outside and you're looking at this in three-dimensional or in nature, you might actually think that they all look the same because your mind, your eyes are not looking at a two-dimensional screen. Here, if you look in the railroad track diagram on the right side here, you might see the flip side of this. You might look at the two yellow bars and think, wow, the top one looks bigger than the bottom one. But the reality is that they are the same size. Your mind is tricked because the perception of depth makes it look like the farther one should be smaller. But the reality is that they are the same size. So that's the flip side of that, where your mind is tricked into thinking that they're different size, but the principles are essentially the same. The size constancy is really just that your mind is tricked into thinking that objects are the same size, no matter how close or far away they are. Now, and this is the principle of brightness constancy. And this is a tendency to perceive objects as a certain level of brightness, even when the light changes. So, for example, in this image, square A is the exact same brightness as square B. Take a look at that. Does it look like that to you? Well, the odds are most of you would think that A is darker than B. And the reason why is because of our image. It looks like there's a shadow over square B, so you're thinking, oh, well, that must be lighter. And the surrounding images around A makes it look darker. But the reality is that there's the same lightness. Now, just as a technicality, I think that I have a really hard time believing it myself. I had to look at this. There might be better pictures that illustrate this too, but this is a close enough picture. The next principle is the principle of shape constancy. This is the tendency to perceive objects as remaining the same shape even when the shape of the object changes on the retina of the eye. Again, this is hard to demonstrate in a two-dimensional screen, but if you look at this, you might think that the door in this diagram is all the same rectangle. But the reality is that the rectangles are not the same, because as you move toward the right, the door on the right is actually trapezoidal. It's not a rectangle. It's more flattened and has diagonals in it. That's because it's a drawing. But if you didn't look at it as a drawing, you might think that they're the same size. In reality, if you take in real life, if you take a coin, you hold up the coin in front of you and you turn it, you might think it's always going to be a circle. But the reality is that your eyes actually are not seeing a circle as you turn it. It turns into an oval because of the depth and the shape that it hits your retina of the eye as. So depth perception, what we were talking about, is really the sense of depth that your mind sees. Depth perception appears to be present at a very early age. So, for example, if you hold a baby out, now, early infants do not necessarily develop, when they're born, they do not have that same depth. So if you hold a baby out over a virtual cliff, as they've done in experiments, they might not actually be afraid because they do not necessarily sense that depth right away. But their binocular, using the two eyes, binocular vision, meaning they're able to see depth using both eyes, starts to develop, and as they get older, and then they will become more afraid of that depth. How do we see depth? Well, there's two ways we see depth. One is through the monocular cues, monocular meaning one eye, and then there's also through binocular cues, that's with two eyes. Visual cues for depth that require the use of one eye are referred to as monocular cues. And these include linear perspective, relative size, overlap or interposition, aerial perspectives, texture gradients, motion parallax, and accommodation. I won't go into that just in too much detail here, but you can look some of these up. I will show some of these in the next picture. So if you take a look at this picture here of a park bench, your mind sees some depth. How do you see depth, though? Well, there's several cues that can give you this idea of depth. First of all, the leaf on the bench in the foreground has greater detail. It's also larger, and the bench is also larger. The bench in the background is blurred, and so that creates an illusion that it is farther away because atmosphere changes, and also because your eyes are not as focused on the distance. So therefore it creates your mind has this image that it's blurred. And some newer phones actually can create this effect. Your smartphones that take pictures like the iPhones, they can actually take pictures in a portrait mode, and that basically allows you to blur out the backgrounds. That gives you that sense of depth. So these are some methods that create a sense of depth using just one eye. So if you close one eye in real life, you would have that depth because of this. Now there's other cues that that use both of your eyes. So visual cues that use two eyes are called binocular cues, and these include convergence and binocular disparity. Here's a picture of a Viewmaster. If many of you may not be old enough to remember this, but a Viewmaster is the old-timey virtual reality headsets. And they only allowed you to see photos using these slides, and you had to turn them manually. But it did give you a sense of depth. And the reason why why did it work? Well, when you look at an image that is a three-dimensional image, it gives you that sense of depth because they are not exactly the same picture. And the way the pictures diverge is what gives you that sense of depth. Another way, that's binocular disparity, but another way that your mind sees depth is through the sense of perspective. Perspective is when lines converge, particularly at the horizon. And so as you can see in this picture of a road going off into the distance, the edges of the road are lines that eventually converge into a dot on the horizon. So this gives you a sense of depth because the farther away they are, the closer those lines get together. Now another effect is related to perception is the autokinetic effect. The autokinetic effect is when the eyes see movement that's not really there. So if you take a look at this picture and you look around, you might feel like the image is moving, right? And even if you not only move your eyes, but move your head especially, you can start to see that the image wobbles. This is called the autokinetic effect. Basically means that it moves by itself. And that's what that literally means. Here's a close-up view of that. So if you want to get a better look at that. Okay. The stroboscopic motion is an effect, is a way or how the mind sees motion through sequential still images that become animated, as in a movie video. When we look at a film or a movie, we are essentially looking at an animated sequence of still images. Those images are put together and create a sense of motion. Otherwise, they're, for example, if you look at an old film strip, they are a bunch of still photos that are put together, but by moving them quickly, it feels like they're moving. And that's actually what is meant by frames per second. You can have 30 or 60 of these frames moving in 1 second, and that gives you a sense of movement. But there are actually a lot of still images that are put together, and it creates that motion. The term phi phenomenon describes seeing movements when adjacent stationary objects change in alternating patterns. For example, if you look at one of these neon signs that have, these signs have flashing bulbs, then it might give you the sense of motion when the reality is that nothing's actually moving; they're just blinking on and off. So this is seen in the use of signs with individual bulbs that blink in patterns. That's the phi phenomenon. Gestalt psychologists hold that people interpret information according to certain expected patterns or rules. So Gestalt psychology also has its principles of perception. For example, as we talked about before, you see these shapes here and your mind constructs images that are actually not really there. For example, in the top left shape, you see a triangle, even though they're really cutouts of 3 circles. Your mind closes these shapes together and creates a whole. And so that's why it's called Gestalt. Gestalt literally means whole. Let's talk about some of the principles of perception that Gestalt psychology also adds. So in Gestalt, the figure-ground relationships refer to the tendency to perceive objects or figures as existing on some background. For example, if you look at this picture, here is a picture of 3 people backpacking. But your mind creates this idea that the 3 people are in the foreground, whereas the rest of the picture is in the background. And now your mind might focus on other things, but your perception is that these 3 are the foreground because they have more clarity, while the rest of the picture is more blurred out. So our mind oftentimes creates a foreground for us, and we might decide in our mind to focus on something else as a foreground. It doesn't have to be necessarily what is depicted in a picture. Because of our tendency to perceive figure and ground, simple figures like the Necker cube are visually ambiguous because there isn't a foreground, or there isn't a figure and a ground. Adding the texture to the cube would provide depth cues, thereby disrupting the illusion. And if you look on the right, this is also the same kind of concept. Which one is the figure and which is the ground? Is it the vase or is it the faces on the sides? So this creates an illusion. It's hard to know which is the front and which is the back. And so the figure that your mind is focusing on is the foreground idea, and then the ground is essentially the background against which the figure stands. So those are 2 terms that Gestalt uses, figure and ground, which is basically like the foreground and the background. Another principle is proximity. This is a tendency to perceive objects that are close to one another as part of the same grouping. So for example, if you look at these dots or circles on the left, you will assume that they're all part of the same group because they form a square that are grouped together. Whereas the ones on the right, you see that they're organized into 3 columns. So you might assume that these are 3 different sections. So that is the principle of proximity. The principle of similarity refers to the tendency to perceive things that look similar as being part of the same group. So for example, we have dots that are white and black. And even though they're all in the same square, you're going to assume that the ones that are black are related and the ones that are white are related, and that they're just alternating. That's because our mind groups things according to similarity. This is one of the reasons why sports teams wear uniforms that are all the same color. It allows people viewing the game to perceive them as one group or one team, even when they are scattered around the field or the court. Here's a picture of a football team, of 2 football teams, and your mind can automatically associate who is on what team because of that uniform. And so rather than your mind becoming distracted by all the stimuli, all these people, you're able to group the people together in your mind based on their similarity. Closure, the principle of closure, is a tendency to complete figures that are incomplete, like the ones we talked about earlier. But the principle of closure is that principle that completes the the figure. It closes the gap. So, for example, here we can see a circle and a square or rectangle. And that's because our mind knows to fill in the gaps. Continuity refers to the tendency to perceive things as simply as possible with a continuous pattern rather than with a complex broken up pattern. So what do you see here in this diagram or picture? You see two keys, right? Well, the one on the right with the base on the right is easy to see, right? But the one that's underneath is actually literally broken up. So if you look at it, it's technically like two shapes that your mind pieces together because it assumes that it's part of the same shape. So that is the principle of continuity. Contiguity is a tendency to perceive two things that happen close together in time as being related. Usually, the first occurring event is seen as causing the second event. So, for example, when you see lightning and then you hear thunder, you assume that the thunder and the lightning are related because they happen relatively close together. Now, they may not be at the same time. The thunder might be a few seconds delayed, but because they occur relatively close in time, you assume that they're related. That's the principle of contiguity. Now, this could also have other effects in your life. Let's say you walk out the door and then you hear thunder. Then you might think it's related to something you did. Some people associate things in their mind because of this principle. So here's a picture of lightning, as you've probably seen many times. You recall that you will remember that when you see lightning, you're going to expect thunder to happen. Another principle is the principle of common regions. In common regions, the tendency is to perceive objects that are in a common area or region as being part of the same group. So in this one, we saw the same exact dots as earlier, but we put the blue circle behind it. So now we might group the dots that are in front of the blue circle together because they're in the same region, whereas we might not have associated them together before because they were not part of the same shape or same organization. So that's the principle of common regions. So these principles can be applied to how humans make meaning of information received through their senses, as well as personal life events that occur. So we might think that, for example, this can be applied to the people we encounter. We might associate the same kinds of people that look alike or remind us of somebody else that we've seen before. Or we might we might have a principle of figure and ground in our mind. Like we might focus on certain events or ideas in our mind, and other ideas and events in our life might go into the background as we don't focus on those things. So that's why you might hear this concept of looking at the silver lining in the clouds, right? That's basically how do we make meaning of the events in our lives? Do we focus on the negatives or do we focus on the positives? Another principle might be the principle of contiguity. Like, for example, if you go to the doctor and they ask you about symptoms, you might associate all these symptoms together that they all sound like they're all related, but the doctor might say to you, well, just because you have a cold and a headache at the same time doesn't mean that they're related. They might be, but they could be different things. And so that's, sometimes people confuse them because they think, because they occur at the same time, they're related, but that's not necessarily the case. So with all these principles in mind, this raises the importance of our environment and what do we focus on. So the environment we surround ourselves with ultimately affects our perception of the world we live in. So, for example, if you are always around, if you're always in the city or you're always around people and congestion and traffic, you might be a little uptight and anxious because your mind is always on the go. Whereas if you're surrounded by peaceful environments, you might be more at peace because of it. So just think about the kind of environments you surround yourself with. And what effect does your environment have on your nervous system or on your mind? Too much immersion in media can actually create a hyper reality where we become disconnected from the real world because we're so caught up in electronic entertainment and games and movies and things like that. And people become so enamored in sports or comic books or movies that they lose touch with the real world around them. So there's a lot of implications for the study of perception for us today. As we've said, we want to think about what do we focus on, and we also want to pay attention to how do we go about perceiving and sensing the world around us. And it also raises the question of how aware are we about what's around us. For example, when you go to the park, do you take time to smell the flowers, or are you so busy that you can't? And there's also spiritual implications of this as well. The Bible says that whatever we fill our minds with can have an effect on us spiritually. Luke 11, verse 34 says, "Your eye is a lamp of your body. When your eyes are healthy, your whole body also is full of light. But when they are unhealthy, your body also is full of darkness." In other words, what we look at or what we focus our eyes on can affect the health of our mind and our whole body. And if you think about the kinds of things that you focus on, how does it affect you? For example, if you pay attention to negative news all day long, or if you're listening to gossip about people, or if you're watching pornography or bad movies, how does filling your mind with negative things shape your perception of the world? For example, research shows that people who are in pornography may end up having negative or distorted perceptions of women, for example. So what do we focus on? That can have an effect on the way we see the world. So wouldn't it be better if we had an accurate perception of the world around us? And the only way we can do that is when we pay attention to what we're feeding our senses. And is it accurate information? And I would say the closer we get to nature and the real world, then the better it is. Otherwise, the more we fill our mind with media, the more distorted it will be. So my hope is that all of you, all those who are listening to this, will want to have a better perception of the world. And the best way we can do that is to take time to think about how we can fill our mind with positive things. And I hope you can join us for next chapter, chapter 15, Making Memories, where we're going to talk about the subject of remembering. Thank you.